So in 1995, Lawrence Fishburne introduced many of us to the story of the Tuskegee Airmen from the movie he starred in. It was the movie that would captivate the heart of Americans. So let me go back. So the movie that captured the heart of Americans and taught Americans the impact African Americans played during the war and the military. There were over 900 Tuskegee Airmen that joined the group over the 5 years that they were formed, and that was from 1941 to 1945. Today we will teach you how the Tuskegee Airmen and women, did you hear me? Tuskegee Airmen and women made an impact in Columbus, Ohio through housing, community, and social economics. This week and next week, we'll dive into this conversation and provide you with resources that we use to this very day to carry the conversation. Grab your wine, H2O, or some iced tea and join me for a little bit of local Black history. You won't want to miss this!
Columbus has always had a rich African-American history. From the late 1800s to present day, we've always been on the move. It's as if every street has a story to tell. And our very own community historian, Rita Fuller-Yates, is here to tell it.
Go girl, do your thing. Go girl.
That's right, your homegirl's on the scene. She's out here uncovering the facts and sharing the history in the streets. Let's go.
Thank you for joining me, you guys who just tuned in. You're joining me for another episode of History in the Streets. I just saw my mama's name pop up. Hey, Roberta Amerson, we dedicated today's show to you. For those of you that don't know, my mother was in the military. She was part of the Army. And what's amazing about her story is that she joined the military at the young age, I should say. At the young age of 34. Where are my 34-year-olds at? Where are my 34-year-olds at? Can you imagine going to boot camp at 34? Well, that was my mama, and she did it successfully. Hats off to Roberta Amerson. Thank you for serving. I'm standing on the barracks in the Air Force Base, better known as Rickenbacker Air Force Base. Today, but during the 1940s, the Rickenbacker Air Force Base was known as the Lockbourne Army Air Base. From 1946 to 1948, it was the official base for the Tuskegee Airmen, 477th Composite Group. The men were assigned here after World War II and commanded by 4-star General Benjamin Davis. But before we go too far in the story, I know many of you know the story of Tuskegee Airmen and how they helped shape America. Just in case you forgot, here's a short video to use as a refresher.
The dim light of hope never blazed brighter for Black Americans than during an era in American history when they began challenging the discriminatory practices of the armed forces. Key to the demands of major Black organizations, such as the NAACP, the National Urban League, and others, was for the designation of centers where Negroes could be trained for work in all branches of the Aviation Corps. It was not enough to train pilots alone, but navigators, bombardiers, gunners, radio men, and even mechanics. Under this collective pressure, Congress made concessions by passing Public Law 18. Under its directive, an air school to prepare Blacks for military service was authorized. 91 of the 100 young Negro college students enrolled in the civilian pilot training program qualified for civil licenses during 1939 and 1940. In spite of all these facts, the Army Air Corps refused to alter its stance and allow Blacks to fly. In 1941, with guidance from the NAACP, a Howard University student named Yancey Williams filed suit against the War Department to compel his admission to an air training center. Almost immediately, the War Department responded by announcing that it would establish an air unit near Tuskegee Institute, Alabama, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Activated March 21st, 1941, the Fighting 99th began training ground support troops at Chanute Field, Illinois. Eager young black Americans received specialized training in maintenance engineering, armament, and communications. Just a few months later, an inaugural address was given at the Tuskegee Institute, initiating the training of black aviators for the United States Army Air Corps. This hard-fought privilege brought with it a great responsibility. The nation was watching, and the fate of future black military aviation rested in the hands of these intrepid young flyers. In a bold and inspiring departure from the expected, the contract for construction of Tuskegee Army Airfield was awarded to the firm of McKissick & McKissick, headed by a black architect and engineer. In July, construction began on the facility for basic and advanced flying training. The first class for pilots consisted of 12 cadets and 1 military officer, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. It commenced primary flying training July 19, 1941 at Moton Field. Soon, young Tuskegee graduates would show the world they could not only fly, but fight. Shortly after graduating in the first class of 1942, Second Lieutenant Charles DeBow was stopped on the street by a white civilian and asked, "You one of those new colored flyers over at Tuskegee?" He proudly answered that he was. "Tell me one thing, what do you boys want to fly for anyhow?" he was asked. Shocked but not surprised, DeBow said he couldn't really think of an adequate answer at the time, but afterward realized the simple elegance of his answer. He was flying for his country. He felt he had a job to do for his country and his race. And just as Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver had proven themselves as educator and scientist, he might prove to someone that Negroes could become good pilots and officers. Armed only with their bravery and determination, fueled by dreams of dignity for others like themselves, Lieutenant DeBow and 4 of his fellow pioneers, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., Second Lieutenant Lemuel R. Custis, Second Lieutenant George S. Roberts, and Second Lieutenant Mac Ross, became the first graduates paving the way for the other 961 black military aviators who were trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield during World War II. Under the command of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., 450 of the graduates served as fighter pilots, attaining dignity and glory in the aerial war over North Africa, Sicily, and Europe.
Cool, right? So as you can see, the Tuskegee Airmen were more than pilots. They were innovators and leaders of our country and our community. The story doesn't stop with how Tuskegee Airmen helped America, but it comes closer to home, like real close, like a neighbor. Did you know that the Tuskegee Airmen helped to establish many entities of the black community as leaders, advocates, and examples of black excellence? They began changing the mindsets of how America locally and nationally saw black people. Columbus residents and black immigrants begin to learn from the value of home ownership, higher education, and social economics. I had the pleasure of sitting down with John Mitchell and Edward Morass, who were presidents and ex-president of the Tuskegee Airmen Ohio chapter.
That was the first house built for black veterans, particularly built for black veterans. And what happened is when they built the freeway, they cut part of that off.
They cut it in half.
And most of it's gone now, you know. But yeah, that was the first part of in any place in the United States. But most of them ended up doing something in the city, running for some kind of office or something like that, and others became doctors, and lawyers, teachers. They all did very well, you know.
They maintained their legacy of leaders.
And to me, is the legacy. Okay, because the Tuskegee Airmen, as well as they flew, as well as they were trained, they didn't win the war, World War II. What they did was change America's thought patterns, or their thoughts of what does it mean to be African American, not only for white Americans, but also for a lot of black Americans. And that's what's evident in Columbus, Ohio. If you look at what was happening in Columbus, Ohio from the 50s to all the way into the 70s, you will find it was really led by a lot of or influenced, that's a better word, not necessarily led, but influenced by these African American Tuskegee Airmen.
Pretty cool, right? Those are the president and the ex-president of the Tuskegee Airmen Ohio chapter. We thank you for their service. We also thank you for tuning in to another episode of History in the Streets. I'm your host, Rita Fuller-Yates, and I thank you guys for joining us every week at 6 o'clock. We have changed our time considering school is no longer in, and we're able to spend our time with the adults sharing some history. Mr. Morast and Mr. Mitchell spoke about the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen and the values they brought to the city of Columbus. Home ownership, community being one. Hanford Village would be one of the cities one of the communities that many of the men would move to with their families. Hanford Village was founded in the early 1900s, just east of Columbus, with its own mayor, police force, fire department, businesses, and park. After World War II, a subdivision of Hanford became a segregated community for returning African American veterans to settle using the GI Bill. Hanford then became one of the few places involved in an all African American post-war housing development program in the United States that included the Tuskegee Airmen. Don't you love our rich Black history? So now when you're driving down Alum Creek, you make a right off of Livingston and you see a development to your right, immediately there is a historical marker that says Hanford Village. Highly recommend you taking a stroll and seeing where our humble beginnings started. So you see, the Hanford Village was a beautiful, segregated community that gave Black people the opportunity to build homes and establish their very own communities. We can thank many of the Tuskegee Airmen who did not only help build the homes, but were a major factor to being an example of leaders and Black excellence. The Hanford community still remains today a major part of our historical story. We don't want to miss any of this story moving forward. Please continue to share this story with your friends and family as you're driving down Livingston. Take a peek inside our little bit of history. Now, we can't talk about the Tuskegee Airmen without talking about legacy. Not only were the men leaders in the community, but they were men of change. They changed the mindset of Black boys and girls about the career of aviation and the freedom of desegregation. We have a couple examples of these people that was perfect examples from Columbus, Ohio, of how the Tuskegee Airman played into his life personally. This particular person's name is David Harris. He was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, was born on December 22nd, 1934. He was the son of Walter and Ruth Harris. He graduated from the Ohio State University in 1957 with a degree in education. He was finally accepted into the advanced ROTC after a few rejections, that is. And on December 3rd, 1964, quote that, December 3rd, 1964, he became the first Black commercial pilot to work for one of the nation's major carriers, American Airlines. Did you hear me? He's from Columbus, Ohio. Again, thank you, Tuskegee Airmen. I believe in my story that they played a huge part in making it known to David that it was possible and that he could do it because they did it. Thank you again, Tuskegee Airmen. So, the Tuskegee Airmen that didn't make an impact on the young men of Columbus, it's safe to say that David wouldn't have had the courage to continue the mission. Another national figure that would be impacted by the desegregation of the Air Force is Jackie Robinson. We all know his story. We don't need to know much about what he did to change America. But he too would become the first Major League Baseball player due to the color lines being broken. So again, we have to pay attention to the timeline of history and know that one thing affects another thing. White people was sometimes afraid of Black excellence. But when one thing opened up, like the Tuskegee Airmen, that opened up opportunities for others, just like David, as well as Jackie. Again, we say thank you to the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, apart from being examples of leaders and legacy, the Tuskegee Airmen knew the power of giving back to the city of Columbus. I think that's huge. Whenever you're a part of legacy, it's very important that you have processes set up so that you can give back. And not only giving back, it allows for your process to continue to grow from generation to generation. Watch this clip and we'll discuss it in a minute.
And what we're doing here is trying to introduce young people to the various careers of education through the Tuskegee Airmen experience, letting people know how important it is to have that education, have that opportunity, and also through the Organization of Black Aerospace Professionals, which we formerly call OBAP, which is basically an organization that, again, tries to do the same thing, is to get young people involved in the various careers in aviation.
So it's pretty cool that they've decided to set up a program that helps your children learn more about aviation. If you have a child interested in aviation, or you notice amazing risk skills, maybe they're not afraid of heights, maybe you see them jumping off of things and never being afraid, you may have a future pilot on your hand. Please contact www.buckeyetiger.com to learn how to get your children involved in this program. It is a wonderful program, and some of the children that have graduated from the program have pursued aviation. So again, where there is a dream, we do have resources available to help your children with it. Thank you again, Tuskegee Airmen. Tuskegee Airmen were not the only ones in position of power. There were Tuskegee Airmen women. I had the honor of sitting down with Pia Jordan, whose mother was a Tuskegee Airman, and she shares her story on how women helped shape America. But before we go, I know we are taking up a lot of your time today, and I thank you guys for joining us for a little bit of history. But before we go, we do have to watch this quick clip of one of our very first Black women stories, and we'll discuss it when we return. In February 1958, Ruth Carroll Taylor became the first African American to serve as a flight attendant in the United States. Her duties involved taking charge of passenger safety and comfort on a Mohawk Airlines flight from Tompkins County Airport in Ithaca, New York to New York City. Taylor graduated as a registered nurse from the Bellevue School of Nursing in 1955. After working for a few years as a nurse and then an employee of the New York City Transit Authority, she decided to pursue a career as a flight attendant, a position that was widely termed at the time as a stewardess. And more specifically, she was the first African American flight attendant. So now you know who Ruth Taylor is. It's really important that you take notes of these individuals that made an impact not only locally, but nationally, so that you can share the story. Again, where the history is confidence. And it's really important that we understand where we're rooted in. We're rooted in excellence and greatness. Thank you, Donna Jackson, for continuing to watch me. Thank you, Kenya. Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Gija. Thank you, Teresa. Hey, Vida. That's my partner in crime. Thank you, Al, for continuing to watch us. Now, you guys learned today. I try to keep y'all tight to a half-hour schedule because I know how important it is to be with family on a Sunday evening. But more important, you guys learned some amazing nuggets today. You not only understood why Tuskegee Airmen played an amazing role in Columbus, Ohio, but nationally. You now understand some key players that helped continue to share the story of Tuskegee Airmen. You now understand a resource that you can use to learn more about aviation. You also understand a couple of people that played a major part in being an example. And now you know all about a community that was created specifically to help build our community as Black people. This concludes our episode today of History in the Streets. We will continue this conversation next week. This is a two-parter. Today we talked more about the history of Tuskegee Airmen, and we introduced the conversation of Tuskegee Airmen women. Next week, we're going to finish that conversation regarding the women, because again, sometimes we miss the details. And I believe that the Tuskegee Airmen women is a story that we have yet to hear more about. I am your lifestyle expert and your local historian. I love doing this stuff, you guys. I just absolutely love it. But I need help in growing the community. I don't ask for money, but I will ask for you to share and continue to share to your friends and family so that this history community can continue to grow. I am your lifestyle expert, Rita Fuller-Yates. I don't do none of this in vain. Everything I do is to help you grow so that you can know more about where you come from.
Tune in next week as we talk about the lesser-known women of the Tuskegee Airmen.
My mother was one of the Tuskegee Airmen nurses. They were officers. The pilot cadets had to salute them, and as one told me, you could look but not touch.